welcome to my talk. My name is Emre Deniz. The slides up, great. And my talk is titled, I Know Kung Fu. It's centered around giving you an overview about the serious games industry in 2018, looking at some of the trends, some of the technologies, some of the paradigms, and I think we're also going to be essentially looking at things like the background of serious games, how those definitions may have changed, what's different, anything ranging from existing definitions to how the markets may have merged. We're going to be talking a little bit about the serious games market, about how it's become quite diverse, about some of the emerging regions and practices, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the trends in the serious games industry. What are things that people are doing? How are serious games emerging? What are some of the techniques, the technologies? What are the things that are impacting our industry, that have impacted our industry and are projected to impact our industry? And then finally, we're going to be looking at the ethics and some of the research questions that are coming up as new technologies enter into the market, as well as looking at the future of serious games. So what are some of the concerns, or what are some of the positives? And hopefully that will give you a good overview of the state of the serious games industry in 2018. So I'm going to do QA as well at the end. So you'll have 10, 15 minutes. So jot down some questions if you see a slide that's interesting. So my name is Emre Deniz, and my background is in mixed reality, virtual reality, and augmented reality in both the arts and the production and business development side of it. And I've been in the industry for the past 5 years. I started in 2013, I think it was, as an artist in the industry, and since then I went on to found a subsidiary company to the company I was originally working at, which was Opaque Media Group, that was focused on simulation training, serious games, and a depiction of space. So I was the CEO of that company for about 1.5 years, and just recently this year, I stepped down to take a business development role as well, holistically for the entire organization, looking at aerospace, astronautics, defense industries, and a range of other kind of fields and practices. So, Opaque Space was founded late 2016. You may have heard of us from our partnerships with institutions like NASA or with Boeing on the CSD-100 Starliner program. We've done some award-winning work in a depiction of space as a game for entertainment, or an edutainment game. And we've also done kind of a range of both public and private projects for various industries and institutions. We also started in the industry with some of the first commercially or even developer available kits in virtual reality back a while ago now. And that's given us a lot of insight into the field of serious games and into how these practices have evolved over the past couple of years. Okay. So our most famous, I guess, or our flagship work is obviously the Earthlight franchise, which depicts the journey of an astronaut in virtual reality and what it's like to be on the International Space Station in low Earth orbit. This was built in collaboration with NASA, who had been very generous to give us a lot of insight and a lot of, I guess, research material, as well as their time and space, pun intended, to be able to build these experiences that are quite realistic. But the great thing about that in terms of background is that when we built this game, we were able to actually impact the idea of astronautics training in virtual reality. So, for example, some of the technologies, content, assets, even the game design that happened in Earthlight was transferred to NASA Johnson Space Center for research into astronautics. For example, the Earth is a one-to-one representation of what it's like to be in low Earth orbit. The Canadarm model was sent over to JSC for them to play around with the Canadarm as well in virtual reality. Another good example is that Canadarm actually ended up going to the European Space Agency's Astronaut Training Center to help them with, I guess, gamifying cargo loading and unloading for a future moon colonization mission. So some of the other things that we do is the recreation of kind of really complex training environments and gamifying these environments, or to create experiences in these environments that allow for us to have the ability to prototype or to test or to conduct research into how training may happen, or to experience these environments without going into them. And this example being the neutral buoyancy laboratory at the Sonic Carter facility in Houston, in Texas, where astronauts actually dive to train to experience what it's like to be in microgravity. Okay, so some of the work that we've done this year or recently has also expanded out from just space to serious games in defense or civil engineering. Some of these things actually range from trying to create experiences and interactive, I guess, games out of theory work or out of very complex and nuanced topics. And some of them are actually moving into the field of certifying people through play, through engagement and through interactivity, so that they're able to prepare for real-world experiences through what they're able to do inside of XR technologies. But we also love making games. So we are always working on creating more accessible and kind of more entertaining and engaging depictions of space, whether that's colonizing the moon or it's looking for aliens, or traveling to distant stars and understanding how planets and astrobodies interact with each other. And we try and draw from a wealth of experience from academics and experts in the field in order to create these things so that people really gain insight into what it's like to be up in space. And that's been our DNA since establishment. So let's kick off by having a look at a quick background in serious games. And I know that the definitions and the background of serious games is something that is quite open to interpretation depending on who you ask. So one of the common definitions that I found whilst looking into it was that serious games are essentially designed for a purpose other than purely for entertainment. And that definition actually rings quite true previously. And as technologies have changed, and as markets have changed, and as the way that developers in both sides of both entertainment and education, or assessment or training and simulation, develop experiences that can become quite hybrid, this definition actually starts to become a little bit more interesting. So the baseline that I started off with is when a game is designed for the purpose of other than entertainment, the common definition of a game is that it's a serious game. And it establishes a series of characteristics and properties that encompass a wide range of things, but essentially boil down into games that are deployed for other than entertainment. With the idea being that it's designed or it's conceived in order to meet those goals and to have measured learnings and outcomes and things like that. In simplifying this, we are developing a spectrum where different markers such as complexity or fidelity or different outcomes and the accessibility levels of interactive experiences get to define some of the properties of what a serious game is. But this is actually becoming quite difficult and confused in the current market space, especially as games for entertainment rapidly develop themselves in order to turn serious subjects into entertainment forms. And it becomes quite difficult nowadays to tell the difference between what's a serious game, what's a game for entertainment, as games for entertainment start to create experiences that are extremely educational, that are based on simulations, and that are based on trying to depict a subject matter or the nuance behind a specific experience so that you gain a lot of privileged insight into what it's like to experience that. The concept of entertainment has become quite muddled and mixed now because serious games themselves are trying to find ways to make their topics and their forms of education also entertaining and engaging and to drive more interaction from their users. So we're starting to look into essentially an industry that's become quite intermixed and quite interlocked, so that the properties and characteristics of serious games has kind of shifted a bit from games that are designed for purposes other than just for entertainment to perhaps something a little bit different. And this is perhaps one of the most significant kind of basis for shifts in how the markets in 2018 and how the applications of serious games across various industries are starting to evolve by using consumer technologies or practices ranging from headsets, mobile phones, game engines, to even just marketplace plugins and assets. And we're starting to see a bit of a paradigm shift in how people are looking to deploy serious games. And I think, especially this year, and probably in the past couple of years as well, instead of defining serious games as games that are designed for purposes other than entertainment, we're starting to think about serious games as any form of interactive experience that is deployed for a purpose other than entertainment, as games for entertainment can now be deployed for purposes other than entertainment, and serious games can actually be deployed in order to provide entertainment and insight into their subject matter. And we've seen a lot of that now in terms of games that are released on PC, console, that are released in simulation laboratories, that are released on the web with assessment. And I would imagine that in the future, it's going to become quite difficult for us to actually take serious games out from the games as a holistic kind of industry, and instead look at it as a specific form of deployment or a platform usage or even a genre that is encompassed in one specific umbrella. And feel free to disagree at the QA section. We can chat a little bit about that. So now, where are we in 2018 with the serious games market and industries? There's a couple of really interesting data points that came out from having a look at the markets as well. Serious games industry is growing, and it's growing at a pace that is making it difficult for analysts especially to predict how it's going to grow. So the field of serious games has expanded to every single industry imaginable. We've gamified and we've created serious games and interactive experiences and units of measurement or success or engagement from every subject, except law. I couldn't find anything about law. Apparently you can't make law fun. But ranging from policing to healthcare, to even retail customer service, to mining, to factory kind of logistics management, there are games about everything at this point. And they're actually developed by an enormous and diverse array of developers around the world. And the shift in the focus of the serious games industry away from Western-specific or Western-focused developers into a much more global kind of community has been very prominent in 2018. So the serious games market in 2018 actually was subject to a range of revisions. And all of these revisions have been quite positive. So back in 2015, in 2016, the market outlook for 2020, 2023 was in the orders of $5, $6, $7 billion. But nowadays, we're looking at $17 billion in excess by 2023 for this market to rapidly grow. And the corrections for annual growth has always been revised and corrected to actually just increase. There's a number of different reasons for that, and we're actually going to talk about that in this talk. They boil down to things such as access to technology, lower barrier of costs for previously bespoke technology solutions, more and more developers being able to access authoring tools, and the rise of developing nations and regions that have access to technology platforms that they previously did not. It's actually so rapid as a growth that every technology report that I read had specific warnings to legacy software simulation education developers about trying to take heed of the fact that game developers as a holistic community were entering into their space and were actually quite a severe threat to existing dominances, monopolies, or market practices. So there are over 900 game suppliers in 2018. The annual investment from private markets into this space has exceeded 1.5 to 1.7 billion. Sorry, and we're gone. Oh, it's actually restarting. I think the education institutions I was talking about before may have had a hand in this. Great, yeah, nothing's been hacked. So we've got 122 plus countries now that are involved in creating and consuming serious games. And then finally, yeah, the market's growing by, or projected to grow by 37% every year. And this will get revised because this was a revision on a previous statistic by the same report saying that they got it wrong the first time and it's just going to keep growing. Now, the most interesting piece of data is that we need to be aware as a Western industry that the places that are growing the fastest in the serious games industry are actually non-Western markets. And previously this was not the case. Serious games and e-learning, both consumption and authoring, are actually fastest growing in the regions or in countries that are located in the region of Africa. And we're going to talk a little bit about the examples from that. And there are reasons for this. But essentially, there's a growing pattern of usage where a lot of developing nations are starting to create games and experiences that are mobile only or on web platforms. And for those of you that don't know, mobile only nations or developing economies are essentially environments that have skipped PC, that use mobiles or pads or iPhones or Android devices as substitutes for any kind of dedicated PC. With the growing access to technology, it means that these portable mobile kind of devices also have access to a range of XR technologies, but they also have access to web and they're also able to distribute and sometimes even author serious games in different platforms. And this is actually a really good thing because as a concept, serious games previously was dominated by Western societies. And towards the future, it's going to be important for all of you who are developing serious games to consider a global market rather than addressing specific needs of Western countries as well. So we've got a bit of a background in what the market looks like. And the meat of the talk is looking at some of the trends emerging in the serious games industry. Some of these are going to be a little, and some of them are based on practices and case studies that we've seen. And some of them will be looking at new concepts and paradigms that previously kind of locked off entities are now considering. So we're going to talk a little bit about things like commercially off-the-shelf technologies, which have become increasingly kind of commonplace inside of environments that previously used bespoke and completely kind of custom-built tech. We're going to be looking at maybe some of the kind of reasons why developing nations are getting access into the serious games market. So the key three trends that kind of came up that I had a look at that were growing in 2018 was XR, access to like social games, so interconnected games and gamers as well. And the idea of crowdsourced serious games or the access to crowdsourced authoring tools. Now, serious games, the first thing is that XR, we've seen a lower barrier of entry for how you can develop AR, VR, or mixed reality interactive experiences on these platforms. That means that from mobile VR all the way to even mobile high-end kind of store-bought, you have the capacity to create a spectrum of different experiences, like games that are built or deployed for serious reasons. In social games, there is a pattern that is replicated out of Western economies towards, I guess, developing nations and emerging kind of economies that is focused on consuming experiences that are socially connected, that have community leaderboards, that have the sharing of information between users and the ability for people to essentially look at their performance in comparison to a group performance or to their peers and colleagues. It allows for people to do self-assessment and self-education as well. And then finally, the dev tools is actually one of the biggest drivers. So with growing access to not just developer tools, but previously very complex kind of technologies as plugins, AI and machine learning kind of out-of-the-box solutions for Unreal and Unity being good examples. And also things like Game Maker, which is allowing for pretty much anyone with an interest in gamifying a specific subject matter or an experience, or to have learning goals or outcomes, be able to kind of do these things in their own time and deploy onto a platform that can actually share with a community of people. So enabling these trends has been largely due to advances and the saturation of key technologies as well. Now, with, I guess, mobile-only kind of developing economies, what we're seeing now is that people are able to essentially share and are able to author, and they're able to experience things and compare their experiences with other people. And then finally, yeah, with the decreased costs, especially in royalties for Unreal and Unity kind of enterprise usage, especially in a serious games environment, we're seeing previously kind of million or billion-dollar entities be threatened by game developers or small kind of startup communities or STEM education kind of entities who have access to a lot of tools that they previously had access to. So my personal background is actually firmly established in XR. So I want to talk to you about how XR platforms are kind of impacting the serious games environment in 2018. So a little bit of background for those of you that may not know, and I know that there's always going to be people in the audience that would like clarification on this. Let's talk about what VR, AR, and mixed reality are. So virtual reality is the ability for you to impose digital assets, a physical user into a digital environment and then completely immerse them into an environment full of digital assets. Whereas augmented reality is the ability for you to place digital assets into the vision of a physical device for a physical user in the real world. Whereas mixed reality is the ability for you to put digital assets into the kind of environment of a physical user, into their vision, but have those assets be aware of the properties of that environment. And the easiest way to explain this is VR is putting you into a box in the computer. AR is the ability to get the computer to put a box into your field of view. And mixed reality is the ability for that box to be aware of all the real world boxes so you can hide that box behind things and have it interact with the walls and ceilings and whatnot. Now, this is a virtuality spectrum, which means that there's a sliding scale of how these technologies can be defined. But generally speaking, this is kind of how we're defining it at this point. So the technologies that drive these things have all become kind of commercially available. You can pick these up from computer stores, you can order them online, and that has been a massive shift in how we've been looking at these industries. So you've got things like the Oculus Touch, the Google Cardboard, AR Core and AR Kit, which have been actually really great drivers in how especially developing economies are able to access AR. And you've got the Magic Leap, the HoloLens, the Microsoft MR headset, but then you've also got AR Core and AR Kit being able to kind of interact now with some limited mixed reality properties. And then we have something called augmented virtuality or hybrid reality, which is the ability for you to use real-world objects inside of a digital environment. So this was something that was the grassroots of our collaboration with NASA, was the ability for you to pick up objects in the real world whilst wearing a virtual reality device so that you're able to replicate the haptic and tactile feedback of specific objects to establish different forms of training. This can be used for both simulations and serious games or the hybrid in between. And everything that we used on this project was actually store-bought, except for the crane. The crane is not store-bought. But if you do find it, let me know, because I'm going to buy one. Okay. Now, this is the bit that gets a little bit interesting. So previously, the headsets and the XR technologies that were used for these purposes were bespoke, and they were completely outside the realm of access for anyone in this room, unless you work for one of the top 10 defense contractors in the world. In 2016, NASA's own virtual reality laboratory at Johnson Space Center was using garage-built, essentially prototypes. That's actually 2 Oculus kits that have been Frankenstein together, and they're running off a Windows 95 server. And by 2017, those headsets were completely obsolete. And by 2018, now the market has such a wide array and a wide range of technologies available to it that we're seeing the emulation of these laboratories that have existed for 20 years, popping up for just practical training, for experiences, for arcades, and the price, I guess, has gone from a $10 million lab to something that you can set up for thousands of dollars, essentially. And that's sort of huge ramification across the globe in how these things are being used. So with growing access to, I guess, commercially off-the-shelf virtual reality or XR technologies, we're now seeing the ability for anybody to construct complex digital spaces out of empty physical spaces. And a good example of that is a project that we worked on in 2017 to 2018, which was Earthlight Lunar Mission. And that has the ability of using essentially store-bought technologies to put 6 people into a complex physical and digital object-tracked environment where they can, in multiplayer, experience what it's like to be in the moon. And it was built in collaboration with various people from the ESA and from NASA. So it's about depicting the educational qualities of space colonization using very complex technologies. And now the interesting thing is that in 2016 or 2015, the same setup would cost you millions of dollars to get running and off the ground. In 2017, the same technology that is used to drive this probably would cost developers about $100,000 USD. But by 2018, the price point is actually lowered down to sub $20,000 USD to have this entire thing set up, tracked, with objects tracked as well, and networked too. And by 2019 and 2020, that price point is going to actually go down lower with all-in-one headsets and computers that can run 2 or 3 people at a time as kind of microservers as well. So we're starting to see a huge shift in how things are changing. And in terms of looking at bespoke technologies, this current one now uses the Vive 2018 models, but previously they were using a combination of motion tracking technology with active IR, as well as backpack PCs and Oculus headsets. So in the span of less than a year, we went from having a bespoke technology solution to having wireless headsets that are bought with warranty from your local Vive store, wherever that may be. And it's really changed the face of how we consider XR serious games and simulations. Yeah, and this is to give you a bit of an overview about how, using everything that's essentially commercially available, we're able to construct these very complex environments and simulations and serious games, essentially. Now, this is increasingly enabling developers in 2018 to compete in markets where the barrier of entry was exceedingly high and impossible to penetrate. And there's no better example of this now than seeing the adoption and saturation of these technologies inside of our education environments. So this is a great example of a local one here in Melbourne, which is the Swinburne University's kind of virtual reality teaching classroom, where they're able to teach people the human anatomy and concepts in medicine in an interactive way. And future curriculum items that are slated to go into this system will or could include things like engineering, physics, horticulture, or even just really complex theories that can be visualized as big data. Now, in 2016, 2015, or even earlier, it would be unfathomable to think about a 1-to-1 ratio for a student to an XR technology within a publicly accessible kind of classroom space. But nowadays, this has actually become the norm in a range of different universities and academic institutions around the world. In 2017, this was considered groundbreaking. In 2018, if a university doesn't have a VR lab, or at least an XR curriculum, the question is why not? And the question is, what plans have they got to kind of change that? So in 2018, we're starting to see these flagship projects actually go past education into, I guess, practical applications. And a good example of that is the Stanford Medicine's VR laboratory as well. So this was an environment that was built as a world kind of first and a leading XR or virtual reality laboratory back about 2016, I think it was. And many private institutions by this year have actually replicated some of these things. So what they're doing here is the ability for you to sit a patient down with you and visualize surgery before they actually go under the knife. And it was also used as an education tool, and it was used as a pre-planning tool for surgeons to think about how they are going to approach surgery. Now in 2018, however, this same building or the laboratory that's in use here has actually gotten an add-on where they are able to practice in virtual reality, and then they have access to cadavers, and human bodies to actually practice with them with the real knife. So that's cool. That's all part of the kind of AI revolution as they grind us all down. But the thing is that they're able to use these digital experiences to pre-plan, and that concept of how they go from theory or from education to practice is one of the things that's been quite replicated in 2018. And one of the case studies for that, and a great one at that, is a pilot training next program. So the US Air Force is using commercially off-the-shelf kind of technologies to certify pilots and get them ready for test flights. And what that means is that they essentially assign a pilot a HTC Vive unit, an MSI laptop, a gaming chair, their own little kind of computer as well, and they get them to go through different training cycles and modules and even theory inside of virtual reality in order to prepare them to jumping into the real cockpit of a test jet where they go and certify for their flights. Now, one of the interesting things with this, the project's phase 1 has already concluded, is that they went from taking 28 weeks to graduate these pilots down to 6 and 7. And in that, they found that the pilots that graduated from the program had an above 90% competency rate when they got into their test flights, which is far outside the realm of what they expected from the program. And everything that they're using in this program currently is using essentially off-the-shelf technology. And an interesting kind of anecdote is that the computers they use for this were actually bought from a store down the street from the base as well. And apparently came with warranties and things like that. So things have changed a lot this year. And this prototype technology is now being used to certify people and to demonstrate competency in probably some of the most extreme environments that we know, which is basically flying. So in terms of, we've had a look at basically VR. In terms of augmented reality, this year especially, there's been an interesting kind of slump in how augmented reality is able to find its market niche. And the reason for that is because it's kind of stuck between virtual reality and mobile platforms. So augmented reality is best currently deployed by the case studies that I've looked at in terms of operational usage, or where people can use it as a heads-up unit, or they're able to use it as a purely educational kind of application. In terms of serious games, however, some of the best examples that we have seen and will continue to see are location-based games, and how people are creating games out of concepts where players have to move around physical spaces, or they have to learn, or they have to engage in activities that otherwise would not be defined as purely for entertainment. So they're creating entertainment out of activities that were previously not so much fun, like running. Running from zombies is fun. So this is an interesting kind of, I guess, market point in that AR technologies are still trying to find where they fit into this spectrum or into the market as well. Now, a really interesting thing that we've seen is the boom of mobile technologies has come with a serious game boom inside of developing economies. And I talked a little bit about that previously, but with this kind of, I guess, market adoption and uptake in mobile-only countries, what we're seeing is now the ability for a range of game developers to essentially make games and content that are quite diverse but are representative of their own social issues. So you're starting to see game communities rising out of places like Nigeria and Ghana that are gamifying social issues and that are creating interactive experiences that are relevant to them to educate their consumers about these things and try to do good and try to do positive things with that. A good example of that is actually Mosquito Smasher by Malio Games in Nigeria. they essentially made a mobile kind of arcade smasher that teaches you about the concept of malaria, how it's transmitted, what kind of mosquitoes carry it. Until I played it, I actually had no idea that it was only the female mosquitoes that transmit malaria, but apparently that's a thing. There's also My Journey, that's from Leti Arts in Ghana. And that is actually a narrative-driven mobile game that's based on trying to educate players about things like reproductive and sexual health, and talking about things like boundaries and consent. And these are really important. And this is a part of the diversification and inclusion of serious games market that we really need to be paying attention to in 2018. So with that, speaking about all the good stuff, let's talk about ethics, which is really not like, for some people, ethics can be an iffy subject. And for others, it's actually quite an engaging part about our industry. And I want to talk a little bit about research as well and the future of serious games and where we're heading towards. So, what are we looking forward to? What's happening now? First thing that I kept talking about was the idea of commercial off-the-shelf training. So, immersive training and commercial off-the-shelf is something that's quite interlinked with how serious games are being developed now, especially for the XR industries. So, it's the ability for essentially overlaying store-bought technologies and platforms and creating quite immersive and I guess adaptive environments for education, assessment, or just displaying a very nuanced topic in a very complex way. Now, this has had a big impact. So commercial off-the-shelf technologies have had an interesting kind of paradigm shift for how we consume serious games and simulations in previously high barrier spaces. What's happened now is that instead of having one trainer, one sim, and one user, and having that maybe 2 people a week or 3 people a week, or having just one, now we have 20, 30, 40 entire cohorts of people being able to experience a XR kind of immersive training or an education environment. And this has actually caused a little bit of an effect where a lot of these institutions are looking for ways, tools especially, to manage all this data coming in and to manage the outcomes and I guess the learning measures of success of what they build and what they deploy. And this is starting to solidify the idea of virtual training, virtual serious games and simulations. With mass adoption is now coming the ability for a lot of these industries to look for trends in how people consume XR. And it's also enabling people to start thinking about how we use this data or user data inside of these environments to build better experiences into the future and how we can create adaptive experiences. And there's a lot of overlap now between how these spaces are looking at their content and what game developers have been doing for a very long time. And we're just going to have a quick talk about that too. So one of the things that has happened this year especially is that our partners, for example, at NASA and even with the US Air Force have shifted away from even thinking about XR as a training prototype. They've actually locked it away as being, if you want to train people, virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, they're great. Like they work. We know they work. There's data that's showing that they're actually working well from companies like H&R Block that are using VR as their HR induction now, all the way to KFC teaching you how to cook a chicken in virtual reality. What they're looking at, which is a great game by the way, if you can see the video for that. What's happening now is that they need tools to automate and create systematic ways of assessing people. And for those of you that are especially in like the mobile and the web deployments of serious games, you already have access to these tools and analytics and the ways to measure what your users are doing and how to curate that data. But that wasn't available for XR. So 2018 has been, the biggest talking point has been how do we collect the data, how do we curate it, and how do we respond to it? And these entities are now looking at how to do that. And machine learning and AI has been some of the biggest concepts that have been mentioned so far. And they're able to do that a lot more rapidly now because they have access to them. And they're able to do prototypes and use game engines to essentially try and train AI to have adaptive training. So this is actually leading to some new pipelines in how we look at even XR serious games and simulations and training and assessment. this accessibility has been quite interesting, and especially when it's overlaid with biometrics. And what we're seeing now is something that's actually really well practiced in the games industry. But in terms of that disconnect between games for entertainment and games for health, or games for education, or games for assessment and training, it's considered a new concept. And I don't believe that there needs to be that distinction. The idea of dynamic and adaptive content is something that's always happened in games for entertainment, in how we tutorialize, in how we scale difficulty, and how we're able to kind of guide players through experiences and give them the tools necessary to accomplish goals. And what's happening now is that even in a holistic sense, we're starting to look at data that's coming through the way that our users, our players, consume content and have content continually make iterations and change itself in order to fit player profiles. This pipeline specifically has been one of the main kind of considerations into these spaces that were considered prototypical previously. So places like NASA's Hybrid Reality Laboratory are actually looking for EVA research specifically, looking at AI-driven and iterative automated training systems, and even gamifying with like game design and narrative into how they can teach people these concepts and have it continually iterate and evolve itself. But this has raised a lot of ethical questions. So what's happened is that we've started asking some interesting things about how we deploy these technologies, and especially when it comes to XR, and especially when there's mass adoption and mass publication and mass consumption, is that in a virtual environment, for example, especially when we consider it to be games, what about things like jump scares? What about things like overstimulation of people's senses? And this has actually become a bit of a topic of conversation when you look at things like PTS exposure therapy. So where is the boundaries and lines between where we actually are doing good and where we may be causing harm? Thank you. And the other one is, so when we can assess everything about a person, especially their usage patterns, where is the line of intrusion? You know, when we can check for a blink, heart rate, respiration, GSR, like when we can actually have every minute detail of someone in an interactive experience, where does it actually start to breach into their privacy? The other one is, what happens when we take people out? What happens when we automate? What happens when we look for big data and big trends? So what happens when training and serious games, even the way that they're constructed, becomes automated and we take the human being out of that element? And then finally, what happens when existing biases in society transfer to things like machine learning? What happens when our games themselves start to discriminate on people based on things that we already know are implicit or explicit biases in how people are able to access these spaces? And that's going to be a big question, because the more that these things become automated, they will rely on us having a form of equity and a form of, I guess, societal kind of inclusivity in order to not taint these things. Now, we're also going to have a little bit of a chat about how there are some interesting or grey area examples of what's happening in the deployment of this technology. Just have a bit of water. So the first one I wanted to talk to you about was the social credit thing that's been happening. So we all know, for those of you that don't know, China has a social credit program, which is essentially a form of gamification of your trustworthiness or your reputation for businesses and individuals alike. Now, this does dictate a range of things, like your access to public transport and public services, and it also gives basically limits or can give you access to things like financial support and even academic support as well. And a lot of things are based on this score. It's quite prototypical at this stage, and there is actually a lot of people in China itself that have raised concerns about how it's being deployed, but at its core, it's actually like a giant public serious game, and it is using XR technology. So there was a case where people with police officers with augmented reality glasses were able to locate people using facial recognition and bring up even their social credit scores in a crowd as well. The other one that's been quite interesting is the the thing that happened in Shenzhen where they had facial recognition technology and AI detect jaywalkers and display them on giant LED screens, essentially to shame them as well, to not do that again. And these techniques are things that we're actually doing in games right now to try and reinforce certain types of behavior. But we need to start thinking about how this technology and these practices are actually being deployed into wider communities. And the other one, that one down there, is that so there was a factory in China that was developing embedded sensors in uniforms for officials so that they could actually monitor people's brainwaves and look for things like spikes in emotion or lapses in concentration. And we've also seen the deployment of facial recognition cameras inside of schools in order to look for the attentiveness of students and pupils as they're being taught. Now, there is another concern, and this one I think is going to annoy some people, is that there is a concern in how we're merging military and the games industry as well. And there was a professor, Rob Sparrow from Monash, who suggested that we need to start actually thinking about how we do things like advertising, so the ADF's advertising in IGN, as well as the usage of game influencers to talk about the armed forces, was kind of blurring the line between what we consider to be a very serious topic and what we consider to be an entertainment industry as well. And as these things become interlinked, there are questions of ethics and there are questions of nuance and context that we need to be asking ourselves. And everyone's still learning. But we all know about America's Army, for instance, and that was funded by the US government as a recruitment tool, as a games recruitment tool. But that's kind of old news now because the US has sprinted way ahead. In 2018, the US Air Force announced that they were going to release a game that was essentially a flight simulator that is designed to build profiles of the users and to recommend them for not just recruitment, but also for profiling post-recruitment, to build essentially a snapshot of who they are. And this quote comes from the person who commissioned the program itself in order to, I guess, promote the idea that games are no longer just being used for recruitment or for, I guess, announcement of recruitment programs, but they're being used as tools in how the defense industries especially can look at building snapshots of players even before these players are interested in enrolling or moving into the defense sector. And I'm not saying that it's good or bad, I'm just saying that it is an ethical concern that we need to be having into how this technology is being deployed and how we're collecting data. Because the next point is that as we start moving into a huge and mass adoption of, I guess, gamification and serious games and simulation for very public consumption, we need to start asking ourselves about data and privacy. Now, one of the concern points and the ethics points that's coming up is how are we storing the data? I mean, previously in simulation spaces, the way you would store data and the way that you would have access to data was strictly controlled and managed and curated and defined in very restrictive ways. But nowadays, as more developers, especially startups, are going into these spaces, who has access to this data, how the data is actually communicated is quite important because these games are starting to have an impact on people's employability or into their future prospects or into how they're assessed against their peers or against their industries. And if that data was not managed well, it will impact people's lives. And we're starting to see that in some other countries. And I guess that's the other big thing as well. With emerging markets comes emerging experts and industries. So we need to be careful about how we have access to serious games and XR and even social games as well, because we're still figuring a lot of things out. Now, with, I guess, more developers and more inclusivity and diversity in this space comes more responsibility and the need for more communication. In 2018, there was, for example, a serious games panel at GDC about what is wrong with serious games, and they identified things like a lack of measurable success and unified measures of success and objective kind of look at the industry that's unified into how we define things that are good and things that are questionable. And that's just going to become more of a problem as we move on to 2019 and 2020. And I think I'm just on time for questions. Great. Okay, so we have questions now. I'll take one at the back first, and then you.
Question I want to ask, I thought of it early on when you were going the thing with the space program, like you had one scale models of the space
Yep.
station and planet and that sort of stuff. I was just wondering, is there at least a possibility of serious games and stuff going the other way, where, like, because you're talking a lot about how the stuff is becoming a lot cheaper and stuff, I imagine it's not going to be long before people are going to start messing with that and modding stuff, and just how game communities can often streamline things in games, modding, if there's much of a chance for those streamlining from the users to feed back the other way to, like, have more ergonomic and streamlined systems and whatever they're being trained to do.
That is a great question. So the question being asked is about the two-way exchange between content creators and their subject matter, and how they can, especially game developers, can influence existing subject matter. And the answer to that question is overwhelmingly yes. There is always going to be, and this is happening already, that there's always going to be a point in which the consumption of these interactive experiences will inform the way that things like industrial design, space management, logistics management, how these concepts evolve, because they're collecting data. And they're not just collecting data, they're looking at how people are consuming them, how they talk about them, how they modify them, how they create content for them, and are looking to adopt these things. And I think in like a bit of an abstract sense, even our collaboration with NASA HRL, they were adopting game developers' techniques on producing content. And then one of the things they bought from us was that NBL pool. We had a game design puzzle there about connecting cables and going through the kind of each step by step of opening the panel. And they ended up purchasing that as well, because they felt like that was a really good way to communicate some of the more, I guess, nuanced kind of concepts and techniques of zero gravity to astronauts as well. So absolutely, yeah. Hi.
Yeah, just wanted to talk about, great talk, by the way. I guess you've got a dynamically opposed area where you're talking about off-the-shelf hardware.
Yep.
And then privacy and security and maintaining all that data. If we've got, like, obviously the classic is Facebook,
Yep.
and Oculus, then saying, sure, let's use these off the shelf, but then trying to maintain that data privacy issue where you're suddenly just ferrying all that information to Facebook. And they've already said that they're going to use that information.
Oh, yeah, without doubt. Absolutely.
What are your thoughts on sort of, I guess, like, obviously got a big challenge to deliver that, but how do you see, as an industry, we can start to go back to those guys and say, no, screw it, we're not going to give you that information. We're sort of beholden to them because they're leaving the market.
Yes. So there are, the question there is how do we control privacy with commercial off-the-shelf technologies? Because it's not just the idea of Facebook, which is explicit data collection. We are seeing implicit data collection in the way that hardware is manufactured. So there is the idea of intercepted hardware when there's postage. There are some countries right now that practice the idea that if you do buy technology from overseas, it goes to a government-controlled postage center first, and then it comes to you. And the biggest concern around that is that, without doubt, they are actually putting monitoring hardware or software into these things. The concept behind that is so well known that, for example, with the United States, if you're working in defense, you can't just buy something online. There's a lot of people that don't really kind of respect that, and there are ways that people can gift hardware to people, but the concept of protection still remains in commercial off-the-shelf technologies. Now, a good example and a counterpoint to what Facebook and Oculus was doing was HTC released, and Valve released a enterprise version of Steam that could actually boot up offline and would not send any data, because it was intended for use in spaces that had privacy and data collection in mind. Now, a way that, for example, the USAF is getting around it is that they literally have a physical hard drive. that they have to ship. And I think we're out of time. Yeah, I'll be out there, so if you want to ask more questions, yeah, no problem. Thank you.